Hello, and welcome to Dominion 6, Rise of the Pantocrator. So this is a game that has always been pretty special for me. I've got a lot of hours in Dominions 5. I have not quite as many in Dominions 4, but it's one of those games that I have put a lot of time into and really enjoy playing. I've made some really good friends through it, and it's one of those games that definitely scratches an itch for me, I guess. Um, Anyhow, what I wanted to do is, especially with the release of Dominion 6, um, there's been some really great new player content. Some of the stuff from Icon Gaming has been exceptionally well done. Big shout out to him, especially as a new player. Das Tactic. Um, I I personally don't care for his delivery style, but I know he's very popular and he's a really nice guy. So maybe check him out as well. Of course, we've got Lucid Tactics, the sort of godfather of Dominion's YouTubers. He's been doing some new player stuff as well. And what I wanted to do is rather than try and compete with them, I wanted to look at um, sort of people who have a little bit of experience now. The game's been out for about a month, and the the way that the community's kind of grown has been awesome to see. And I feel like at this point there's a fair number of people who've kind of gotten the first couple games under their belt. You've watched a let's play, or been following a let's play. You have a couple single player games under your belt. Maybe you played EA or MA Ulm or Abyssia or one of the other like highly recommended new player nations. Maybe you followed a guide for a god or something like that and just sort of got into it and figured out the basic mechanics. But now you want to look at where to from here. Like, how do I go about figuring out what makes a good god for a nation? How do I go about looking at a nation to figure out what makes it strong, what makes it weak? um, how to enhance its strengths and sort of shore up the areas that might be problematic for it. And I think this makes sense to do both from a single player and a multiplayer standpoint. Single player, because by doing this, you're going to be able to get more out of the nation. It's going to play more the way that the developers kind of intend it to be, as in so much as they intend anything to happen in Dominions. Um, but in multiplayer, especially, is if you decide to get your feet wet in that and figure out the game from that angle, uh, looking at how to competitively design a god and strategize around how you're going to approach playing a nation is really important because the nations play very differently. And to say that there's a particular way to design a god and dominions, even for a single nation, is an impossible thing to answer. I mean, some nations it's a little bit more obvious than others, or there's a little bit more of a path that just makes sense. Like with Ulm, like don't worry about a bless. Focus on early and middle aged Ulm at least. Don't worry about a bless, and focus on your incredible lineup of troops and what can you do to make them better at that, and how can you produce as many of them as you possibly can. So ignore a bless, take scales, and have fun. Um, but there's a lot more to dominions than that. And what I wanted to do here is sort of start peeling back the layers of the onion and looking at how things start to fit together. And the faction that I'm going to use as an exemplar for this is Fomoria in the early age, because they are a very powerful nation. Um, they're also a nation with some very good strengths and some very apparent weaknesses. Um, and they're a nation that is built in such a way that they can go a long way by leveraging synergies between their units their mages, and their pretender. And building something as holistically as possible makes a lot of sense for these guys. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be diving into a pretty deep dive into the units and the commanders of Fomoria. Um, and we're going to look at how they work together and also consider, try and identify as best we can, what is Fomoria good at and what does Fomoria need help in. And then when in the second video, when we get to pretender design, we're going to try and pull all of those strings together in a couple different ways, do a couple examples of different pretenders that you might want to consider, depending on what kind of. Okay, so when you're first looking at a nation, I mean, the thing you always want to start with is reading through the flavor text for two reasons. One, it's going to give you a bit of a sense of the nation, let you know if it's something that sounds interesting to you or not, and kind of decide, hey, is this something I want to play? Um, it's also going to give you some hints, some of them more obvious than others, about what the nation is good at. Like it's going to list the magic paths they're good at. It's going to tell you what sort of troops they got, um, and what kind of priests they have in forts. The most interesting thing here would be the race, the military, and the magic. And if you do happen to see any nation that has strong priests, it means they have Holy Three, which is an important thing to look out for, because Holy Three will let their priests claim thrones, which is normally something that you need either your god or their prophet to do. You need at least Holy Three to claim a throne. So these guys do not have Holy Three, so weak priests, and he's average skill. The magic is always important to note. It'll say what they have higher paths in and easy access to. So air, glamour, death. So you know what kind of spells you're looking at in this case. And then some water and nature. Something that they leave out is there is a little bit of earth as well, which is quite notable, because having earth access, even just a little bit, is valuable. It also talks about their infantry, so we've got three different types of troops here. Uh, in our case, it's Furbolg infantry, Fomorian infantry, and Numidian infantry. So the Furbolgs are these guys on the left that look like little humans. The Fomorians are these guys in the center, and then the Numidians are these guys down here. The the other human-sized people that like purple. Um, and then malformed Fomorian giant, Furbolg, remnant Numidians, ocean sailing, and units able to enter the sea. So that tells us that we can get underwater and we can also cross water. That's actually a really valuable thing to be able to do. Lets you get troops, gives you a lot of mobility on the strategic map, especially with sailing. And then getting underwater, especially if you don't have any competition underwater, like there's no other underwater nations, being able to get underwater is actually also really valuable. Um, they're not great underwater, but you can do it. And sometimes that's enough. Now, the other thing that this tells us that isn't super obvious is where it says malformed Fomorian giants. And what that means is that these Fomorians, because of this curse that they have, um, will spawn with afflictions. And the weaker the unit, so the further to the left it is in the roster here, the more likely they are to spawn like with a limp or with a missing eye or something like that. And afflictions can really kind of suck because you normally pick them up as as like the game goes on and your troops get banged around, they'll get injured. But starting with them really stings, especially because giant troops tend to rely a lot on their hit points for their survivability, which these guys are giants, by the way. Um, and because they rely on their hit points, it it means that over time they really start to get banged up, um, which can be problematic, and identifies kind of the first weakness of Fomoria is that you've got to figure out how to sort of compensate for the fact that some of your troops are just going to kind of suck, even if you did invest in them. Um, the militia tend to have the most afflictions, the warriors the least, and one of the special doodads of their sacred units, the unmarked, is they actually spawn with no afflictions, which isn't normally a huge selling point. It's kind of standard, but for the Fomorians, it is not. Um, so after I've kind of read through that and pulled the information I can out of it, next thing you probably want to do is start to look at your troop lineup. And the first thing you really got to focus on is, what is my chaff? And chaff is a term sort of within the Dominions multiplayer community, or the Dominions community generally, that refers to the units that you expect to like throw into the battle line, and their job is to not die for as long as possible. If they can inflict casualties, great. But realistically, what you want chaff for is to protect your backline with your commanders and your mages and anything else that you don't want in a melee. Um, and the nice thing is Fomoria has some very good chaff options, ranging from cheap and expendable to quite elite. Um, and so starting off, you've got militia and slingers. Now these guys, some nations can make use of their garbage tier units, but um, f- for the most part, you're going to want to ignore stuff like the militia. We're still going to take a look at him though, because he gives us a really good baseline idea of what a Furbolg is all about. And figuring out the baseline idea behind your troops is a really important first step in figuring out a nation. So we can see our Furbolg here. We're mostly going to look at his stat line here. So we can see that Furbolg, with human average being 10, his strength is a little bit higher than normal. Again, same deal with hit points. Normally it's 10, a little bit higher than normal. His attack skill is perfectly average at 10. His defense skill is also maybe a smidge higher than a normal human, um, with a basic defense skill of 11. The reason it shows up as higher is because he's got a shield. And so that's just a piece of equipment that makes it a little bit tougher, that gives him that parry bonus. And if it hits, basically the way it works is if the attack roll beats the defense, doesn't beat the basic defense skill, it misses entirely. If it beats this 11, but not the defense and parry, then it hits the shield instead of the dude, and just gives him more protection and stuff like that. That said, these guys have terrible protection, so the shield helps a little bit, but not much. They also don't wear hats, which makes anything that has the idea of throwing or shooting something at them very dangerous, because arrows will hit you in the head and then bad things happen to your sense of smell or things like that as the arrow pierces through your face. Um, but yeah, so anyhow, they're a little bit stronger, a little bit tougher. Other than that, they're basically humans. But you're not going to want to look at militia in general. Likewise, probably ignoring the slingers. Where your chaff is, or at least your really disposable chaff, is in these Furbolg warriors, one flavored with an axe and the other with a spear. Picking one over the other is kind of personal preference. I tend to like the spear because they also come with a javelin that allows them to huck them ahead of the battle line and do a little bit of damage. Because this actually opens up our first synergy, where you've got the Furbolg warriors. The other stat that I hadn't mentioned yet is size. They're size 3. Now, the way size works in Dominions is you can fit up to 10 size points in a given square on the battlefield. So on a regular old day, because these guys are human-sized, you can fit 3 of them in a square, which means that out of that square, you're going to have 3 dudes poking bronze spears at people. Now, if we go up and take a look at our giants, we see that they are size 6, which means that you cannot fit 2 Fomorians in a square because they add up to 12. However, you can fit a Furbolg and a Fomorian in a square. So what I'll oftentimes like to do with these guys is spread them out in front of my main battle line, and they run forward, chuck their spears, or chuck their javelins, and as they're throwing their javelins, my Fomorian warriors are passing through them to close with the enemy, while these guys covered them from arrow fire and stuff like that, which then lets the Fomorian warriors be the ones to make first contact. Um, and then after that contact is made, these guys come rushing up, and they can filter in between the Fomorians and join them in the front line. And so now, instead of having a single Fomorian in a square, you've got a Fomorian and a Furbolg, which just significantly increases the damage output and also increases the durability, because some of the hits might go to the Furbolg instead, and a dead Furbolg is easier to replace than a dead Fomorian. So by having these sort of mixed front lines, it mitigates one of the other big weaknesses that Fomoria has, which is giant troops. And that kind of brings us to the Fomorians, where if we look at them, and I'm going to skip over the lower guys. You've got another militia, you've got another javelinist. Kind of the two to consider would either be the spearman or the warrior. Militia, you never want to take, especially as Fomorians, because they come too crippled. The spearmen, they start to become workable. I find they still have too many afflictions to be worthwhile, but you could experiment with them. They are cheaper at 20 gold, 17 resources, 11 recruitment points than the Fomorian warriors. So these guys cost more resources, more recruitment points, and more gold. So if you need bodies, you could do worse than use Fomorian spearmen. But if you want something that's actually going to hold a line a bit more effectively, look at the Fomorian warrior. And this is actually a good point to start talking a little bit about those costs, because you'll see here all the different units have a cost. And this becomes really important in Pretender design when you're looking at what scales to take. Some units, like Vanheim is a wonderful example, require very few resources, but a huge number of recruitment points. And if you want to think about how these sort of interact with each other, gold is an overall measure of a unit's quality. Um, this pays for a lot of special abilities and stuff like that. Like if a unit is a giant, it pays for it with an increased gold cost. If a unit is glamored, like a Vanhair, it pays for it through gold cost. Resources represents equipment. So this guy's got a bronze scale cuirass and a shield and a spear and a javelin. All of that comes out of this 10 resources. Otherwise, he shows up bare ass naked. And that's why you compare the Furbolg warrior to the militia. He's only 5 resources because he's got a spear, a shield, and a leather cuirass. So no javelin, and his armor sucks. And that's the difference that those 5 points of resources make. Recruitment point represents training. And that's where you see the strength, the attack skill, the defense skill, the precision, that sort of stuff. That comes through recruitment points. So the higher your recruitment points, the higher this sort of stat line here is going to be. And different scales will get you different bonuses and penalties to each of these. So we'll get into that more with the when we get into Pretender design in the next video. But for now, just think that, okay, these guys cost more recruitment points than resources. Okay, so figuring out a way to boost up recruitment points if I want to use a lot of Furbolg is important. These guys are the opposite. They require more resources than recruitment points. So figuring out how to balance around that is important. Um, Now, the nice thing about giants is they tend to have a lot of hit points. 33 hit points versus, I believe, 11 on the Furbolg. These guys also have pretty good protection. They also have hats, which is valuable. Less likely to die to random arrows, always helpful. And one of the key things about giants is they will hit you like a truck. With a strength of 21, they will pin you to a tree with this spear. Now, the downside is the Fomorians in particular don't actually have that great of an attack skill, but that's not necessarily the end of the world. The purpose of chaff is not necessarily to kill, it's to buy time for other things in your army to do the killing. And these guys will trade. Like they'll do okay against a lot of stuff. But anything that really relies on defense skill, they're going to have a tough time with. So Van hairs are a problem for Fomorians for a few different reasons. One, because the Van hairs have so many attacks, they just chop them to pieces. Two, because the attack skill on your Fomorian warriors is pretty pitiful compared to the very high defense skill of a Van hair. Three, because the Van Heers have glamour, so even if these guys do hit, there's a good chance they just like hit some random illusion. These guys have a very rough time with high defense sacred units. So it's something to really be aware of and be careful of. Pick your battles. Um, don't necessarily go up against a nation that you know you're going to struggle with. And giant troops tend to struggle against nations that can put a lot of attacks out of a single square because additional attacks are going to lower defense skill. And as your defense skill drops, you get hit more often. Then you rely on your protection. And they've got okay protection for the early age, but it ain't fantastic. And so that means that your hit points are going to get whittled down faster than you realize, and you end up taking a lot of attrition with these guys. I'm going to come back to the Numidians in a moment because I want to also talk about the two sacred units because they're also Fomorians. First up is the Unmarked, and these guys are basically just slightly better Fomorian warriors, but they don't spawn with afflictions, and they can take a bless, which makes them kind of mediocre. Their attack skill still isn't great. Their defense skill still isn't great. They have a little bit more in the way of hit points. But other than that, they're basically just a Fomorian warrior. And so you got to ask yourself, what kind of a bless would I give this in order to make it scary? And some nations, again, I mentioned Van Heer, have very scary sacreds. Pan has very scary sacreds. They're nations where, because of the way their sacred units work, it can make a lot of sense to put a very strong bless on them. I'm playing a multiplayer game right now as middle-aged man, and I put Blood Surge on my Knights of Avalon, and they are terrifying. Um, the as far as a sacred unit goes, you couldn't ask for much more than what you get out of a Knight of Avalon. Um, the unmarked are pretty unremarkable by comparison. They've got a bog standard, like sharp stick, um, basic armor, and hit points. And that's really all they have going for them. So you'd want something that would lean into those hit points, like regeneration or something like that. Um, which they'd regenerate 4 hit points a turn, which there's worse things out there, but a lot of stuff is going to do more than 4 hit points of damage to you in a turn. So, especially considering they're only recruitable from the cap, um, these guys are they kind of sit on the struggle bus. They can still be fun though. Like especially playing single player, you can totally build a bless for these guys that makes them entertaining. Likewise, the Fomorian giant runs into some problems that are similar to the unmarked, just worse. They cost a lot more. They do have more hit points, but their protection's even worse because they can't be bothered to wear a hat. And um, although they do have this amphibious ability and cold resistance and stuff like that, they also take 2 holy points to recruit, so you're never going to be able to mass them. And they've got this incredibly inaccurate javelin and a big sharp stick, which, okay, sure. So every turn, they've got a 50-50 chance of just splattering a normal human, is basically what it works out to. Because most humans are going to have a defense skill of around 11 once you don't count their shield. Because the nice thing about having a strength this high is they'll just punch through a shield. They don't care if you have a shield or not. But still, it's a 50-50 chance to hit, assuming sort of an average human defense skill 10, right? Um, And what you really want for a sacred in order to have it be worth a bless is it has to be able to kill. Survive, you can make these guys survive, but you can't make them kill very effectively. So that's one of the reasons why really relying building a bless into them just doesn't make a huge amount of sense, because these guys are already quite survivable. These guys are entirely replaceable. And then you've also got another unit here that is also very survivable, but for different reasons, and isn't sacred, but can only be recruited from the capital, just like your sacreds. So instead of recruiting these guys, what I tend to look at is recruiting these ones instead, because the Numidian warriors are something special. They have this golden spear that is magic, so it's a magical sharp stick. They also carry a javelin, which is cool. Low protection, which is less cool. But they do have glamour, which is very cool. So glamour, I've mentioned the Van Hairs a few times now. Glamour is the same thing as the Van Hairs have, which basically means that when they get into a fight, they spawn a bunch of mirror images of themselves. So whenever they get hit, there's a chance that it hits one of those illusions instead of them. And if that's the case, it just pops that illusion and they continue on all hunky dory. It does abilate away, though, and there is always the chance that that hit will actually hit the real Numidian. But it still provides a pretty significant layer of protection, especially when you figure their defense skill is very high. Again, because of the glamour, it boosts up their basic defense skill. And so by being able to dodge a lot of attacks, it means that the glamour gets hit less often, which means that they just survive longer. They're also stealthy, which is cool. They have dark vision, which if you're going underground is cool. And they've got this iron vulnerability, which is a disadvantage, but there's not a huge amount of um, iron in the early age. You're going to come across a lot of bronze. So it's not as big of a hit on the early age nations as it is on some of the nations in the later age. They really have to worry about glamour and vulnerability. But regardless, at relatively low hit points, relatively poor protection, if they get hit, iron vulnerability or not, they're gonna be in trouble. But until they get hit, they can sit there and dance around and tie up an enemy line for an awfully long time. They also have very good magic resistance, which makes them quite durable when it comes to that sort of stuff as magic begins to come online. And overall, these are just a great unit. Also size 3, so they can filter around with your Fomorian warriors. Um, Very, very good unit. And so with that looking at the infantry or the troops, it's probably time to start looking at the mages. So, having identified that we've got a very durable sort of line of troops that struggles with killing things, that means that what we really got to rely on is trying to identify ways to make our commanders be the ones who do the killing. Um, and Fomoria can do that in spades. And as we go through, we'll kind of get to why. First up, you've got two scouts. You've got a Furbolg and a Fomorian. Ignore them, never recruit them. You start with a Furbolg scout, use him to scout, find an independent province where you can recruit scouts and recruit them from there. That's just a basic rule of dominions. Don't waste fort turns recruiting scouts. Next up, you've got two commanders that I would consider to be troop taxis. First up is the Furbolg Champion. He has a leadership of 75, which is mediocre. No morale bonus, he cannot use formations, but he can lead 75 troops around. And he is quite inexpensive at 60 gold, 12 resources, 1 recruitment point. Your other option for a troop fairy is the Fomorian Champion. And both of these are basically the same. Like he's a Fomorian warrior and he's a Furbolg warrior, just with the ability to lead. This guy's the same. Leadership 75, still relatively cheap. But what you care about with these guys is that leadership skill. And with that in mind, recruiting the Fomorian champions is probably a waste because they cost more and do the exact same thing as the Furbolg champion, which is take troops from a fort to the front, at which point they'll foist them off on an actual commander. And your first actual commander is this guy, your unmarked champion. So he is sacred, so he can take a bless, but also he can also bless, which is useful. Um, Not having, we'll get to it in a moment, but having just sort of a basic priest like this available to bless your mages so they don't have to worry about that is valuable. Like, even if you're not blessing your troops, like if you don't have a bless on your unmarked, what would probably be optimal with a nation like Fomoria would be to try and think of a way to bless your mages. And so by having the unmarked champions be able to bless them, it saves them from having to do it to themselves. Also, he has a significantly better are significantly better options for leading troops. With a morale of 100 or a leadership of 100, he gives a morale bonus. He can have up to 3 squads and he can put those squads in formation, as opposed to these guys who can only do like a big old block of troops. This guy can form them into lines, into double lines, into skirmish formations, things like that. He can do a lot more. Which, by the way, skirmish formations are actually something you might want to consider on the Furbolg, especially if you have them out in front, because it's going to make it a lot easier for your Fomorians to kind of push their way through them and get into the front themselves. So, something to keep in mind. Even though they take a morale hit. Anyhow, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent, which I'm trying really hard to avoid. Next up, we get into our mages, and I'm going to talk about I'll talk about the Numidian champion first, just to get him out of the way, because out of your mages, he's the only one that I don't see too much of a use for. He is sacred, uh, and he does have a little bit of magic, but the problem is 1 death and 1 glamour just isn't going to do very much for you. He's expensive as well. He is kitted out like a Numidian, so he's got the glamour. He's got the basically the same. I mean, the kit doesn't matter so much because if you actually wanted to use him in combat, you'd be replacing that anyhow. But he still suffers from some of the same weaknesses as the Numidians, where he's got a relatively limited pool of hit points. One possibility with him would be if you could get his glamour up by 1. There is a spell called Horrible Visage or something like that, that would allow him to basically be scary. So you could possibly use him for that, but then you got to figure out a way to get his glamour up to 2. So either he's using gems or something like that. And it's a pretty expensive one-trick pony, especially when you have other better ways of being scary that we'll get to at some point. So this guy's probably not worth it. Anyhow, I'm talking about him too much. Um, The first of the mages that I would recommend probably building a lot of are these Firbolg Druids. And that's because these guys are your research monkeys. That's what they exist to do. They sit and they read books. And at 9 research for 95 gold, they are very efficient. Now, the downside is they aren't sacred, so they cost a reasonable amount of upkeep. But the other thing is they're all also Air 1, so they can craft owl quills and things like that, which is a very valuable way to boost their research. They go from research 9 to research 15, and that's something. Um, as far as their paths go, they start with the air. All of them have air, and then they'll get water, earth, nature, or glamour. The two that are most well, they're all interesting. The earth and the water, or sorry, the earth and the nature are probably the most interesting. Water as well. There's some interesting water stuff that you can get at that we'll talk about more once we hit pretenders. Um, but yeah, so they do have those sort of random paths as well that is valuable. Your Fomorian Druid. So unlike the Firbolg, who basically exists to research and not do much else, the Fomorian Druid is your battle mage, and he is very good at being a battle mage. He has Air 2, which opens up the possibility of casting big air evocations and lots of battlefield stuff with air. Um, he'll also begin with a random of some sort. This is less useful. What you really have these guys around for is that air magic and the fact that they are sacred. And they're also priests, so they can bless themselves. If you don't have a champion kicking around, these guys can bless themselves. Now, Air 2 is really valuable because if we get into spells here, I'm just going to hop over here, and we look at, not enchantment, at evocation, just looking at air. You've got spells like Lightning Bolt, which you get very, very early on. And Lightning Bolt is a wonderful spell. It's very accurate. It does a lot of damage to an individual person. This is great for killing commanders. This is great for taking out elites that don't have great shock resistance. It's an overall just extremely potent spell. It'll also shock people to stun. Oh no, this one doesn't. Does it stun? It doesn't stun. It gives them a little bit of this minor area shock as well. But realistically, the purpose behind this is to zap the snot out of things. If your Firbolg Druids do happen to get into close combat, they also have this Shockwave. It's not a great spell for them to have to cast because they also don't have armor or anything like that, and if the enemy's reaching your Druids, then you're probably in trouble. Stormwind can be helpful for knocking down troops and sort of making it easier for your Fomorians to sort of deal with the enemy line. Blasting a bunch of this, it's not going to do much to your Fomorians. Like they're not really going to care. Large beings are rarely affected by the spell. But it will really mess up your enemy's line, especially because it's got such a big area of effect. So that can be one way to help mitigate some of the weaknesses of your Fomorians. And then at level 4 in Evocation, you get Thunderstrike, which is a real big boy spell. It does a lot of damage. It's got this big area of effect that stuns and does extra damage and all sorts of stuff like that to everybody within 10 squares. The downside is it's got a fairly low precision, but it does have a very long range. And it costs a lot of fatigue. So using this as like an opening salvo, and having a bunch of Fomorian Druids casting Thunderstrike right at the beginning of a battle is a scary thing to come across. Now you will notice it's Air 3 and the Druids are only Air 2. Now there's two ways we can get around that, and we'll deal with sort of how that works later. But there are ways to boost those Fomorians up. It also, under Conjuration, lets you do things like summon air elementals, again, once they hit Air 3. Um, it lets you do, where is it here? Cloud Trapeze, which is a teleport spell and lets you fly around the strategic map very effectively. Um, it lets you get electric resistance up yourself, which is definitely helpful if you're flinging thunder strikes around. Avoid killing your own troops. Um, and yeah, just overall, they are a wonderful, wonderful battle mage. Now, I did mention that they are only Air 2, and their randoms will never get them to Air 3. They'll get Water, Death, Nature, and Glamour. Um, but there is a way to get them to Nature 4. And that is if they synergize with a Fomorian king. Now, again, we'll come back to look at the Numidian sorceress in a moment here, but I wanted to talk about the king because he is a big boy wizard. He is, well, literally physically huge. He's size 9, which is as big as anything gets in the game. He is unbelievably expensive at 675 gold per turn. He also takes 4 recruitment points, so he will always take 2 turns to recruit. You can only ever recruit one of these guys every other turn. Resources you don't really care about on a commander like this, but for that you get an incredible super combatant chassis. He's got very high hit points, very high strength. Uh, Mediocre attack skill is a problem. Mediocre defense skill is a problem. But both of those are problems that can be solved. At least the attack skill more than the defense skill. But where he becomes really interesting is when you look at his magic paths. So he's got, in addition to being sacred, he has air level 3, death level 2, and then he will also get another air, another water, or a water, another death, or a glamour. Now, the water and glamour are less useful. I think there's things that you could possibly do with them. I need to play around with glamour more. The water, however, so yeah, glamour a little bit less useful. Water, on the other hand, makes these guys into one of the best super combatants in the game. The water, even just water 1, lets them do things like cast liquid body and Stygian skin and other spells like that that make them incredibly durable. Air magic lets him do things like mist form and personal flight and spells like that. It also allows him to cloud trapeze. Gear you can replace, so you can custom tailor these guys to sort of deal with what you're worried about potentially fighting. The air randoms as well, because they become air 4. And now you can do this with any Fomorian king by spending an extra gem, but the air 4, and we'll pop back into here and go into alteration, where at level 5 we get a spell called Storm. And Storm is a spell that conjures up a storm. It costs a gem to do, and it takes 4 air. So you could do this with one of your air 3s by spending 2 gems, one to boost his path and then one to actually cast the spell. But if you get an air 4, they can cast it with no extra gems. What Storm does is, first of all, it's going to help you out dealing with enemy missiles and enemy arrows. It's also going to screw over anybody who's using fire magic. And it's going to also allow your Fomorian druids to, under conjuration, cast summon storm power, which is an incredibly useful synergy because normally this spell is useless. You can't predict when a storm is going to happen. And sure, yeah, if there's a storm going on and they cast summon storm power, then they get that bonus to air magic. But it's completely unpredictable as to whether or not that a storm will be there. However, by casting storm, it becomes reliable. And so by casting storm and then having the next round having all of your druids cast summon storm power, suddenly all of those air 3 spells become an option. So they can summon the air elementals. They can uh, do all that sort of stuff. It doesn't help with the the ritual spells, but all the combat spells, they're now level 4 or level 3. In addition to that, this guy, the death ones can do lots of big death magic. Like I said, the glamour I still got to play with and figure out how I might use that most effectively, because glamour 1 doesn't seem to do too much. But these guys are also your ticket underwater. Uh, they've got the amphibian trait, which cool, whatever. But they've also got shock resistance and cold resistance. Nice. They have dark vision. Nice, especially if you have to go down into caves or something like that. But then they also have sailing. And so these guys can carry up to 999 points worth of size points of units with them across oceans. And sailing is fast. Like, it's not teleport fast, but you can cover a lot of provinces by sailing. They also have Gift of Water Breathing, which means that any units that are in their army have this water breathing. Now, the downside is they can't bring other mages with them, but your druids can cloud trapeze, and they're your primary combat mages anyhow. At least some of your Numidian sorceresses will also be able to cloud trapeze. So you can sail these guys with an army and cloud, and then the next turn he like makes a beachhead somewhere, and then the next turn you cloud trapeze a whole bunch of sorceresses and druids in, and suddenly you've got an army halfway around the map. That's powerful, especially since like he lands there, he builds a lab or something like that, and then all of a sudden you've got the ability to like summon creatures over there and do all sorts of mage stuff and stock up on gems and generally be a massive pain in the ass in a direction that your opponent probably wasn't expecting you to come from. um, the and then of course the underwater breathing really helps if, like I said, especially if there's not any other underwater nations and you're not going to have a lot of competition under the water. You're not great underwater, but you can do it. And um, that really lets you uh, leverage into just getting extra resources and gold and stuff like that from the undersea provinces. Unfortunately, you can't fort them or anything like that, but still, worth kept picking up if there's nobody else challenging you in the water. Last up is the Numidian Sorceress, and she is another exceptionally powerful combat mage. Now, both her and the Fomorian King can only be recruited in the capital, and the Numidian Champion, which is another reason not to buy him, because he's competing with these two. But she is a very powerful combat caster as well. She can get you very big death. She can get you big air, or very big death and very big glamour, and a little bit of air. Um, they are a very powerful mage with a lot of combat utility, easy to boost up as well. Um, and you can do especially some of the glamour stuff that'll make your troops much more survivable. It'll make them harder to hit. So in addition to having their big old bag of hit points, they might be blurred as well, which penalizes enemies' attacks. You can do all sorts of interesting things with them. Later on, they can also pull it up here under death here. Is it enchantment? No. Is it alteration? No. Yeah, your Fomorian Kings can also do Soul Vortex, which is an amazingly good spell for a super combatant, just as a heads up. But yeah, so they can do Skeletal Legion on your guys with if they've got um, a magic booster, they can do a bunch of summoning for you. They can get these Morgans. They can cast Dance of the Morgans. Uh, that's a little bit tougher to get into because they cap out at Death 3. Most of them will be Death 2, but you'd also need the Air 2. So this is a bit tough to get easily, but if you can do it, this is an incredibly powerful spell. This summons these very powerful ghost women. Goes into a bit more detail on them here, but they're super spooky. And here, I'll show you in the mod inspector. Okay, so yeah, so these are actually all of the different national summons that Fomoria has, at least easy access to. Like theoretically, you can get these unicorns as well, but uh, well, no, I guess you could do it relatively easily. Maybe can they summon? Anyhow, maybe they can summon unicorns. But these are kind of the core of their summonable units, unique ones at least. You've got the Black Dogs and Barghists, who are not stellar. The Barghists are at least sacred. They do have dark vision and dark power, so if you want to go down into caves, they can be pretty cool. So do the Black Dogs for that matter. So that's a possibility if you're fighting against an under like cave nation type thing. But you've also got these Morgans who are extremely powerful. Um, they get this Spear of the Morgan. They have Glamour. They are they ethereal? They're not ethereal. But they fly, they have spirit sight. They're a very like scary powerful unit. Um I thought they caused fear. Oh no, they do cause fear. Yep, they're also stealthy. Incredibly potent unit. And uh your ladies can summon them quite easily, at least through the summon Morgan spell. The Dance of the Morgans is a little bit more challenging, but this gets you a permanent one that you can then have tootling around and following your army, and all of your Namidian sorceresses can cast that. You can't quite get into the really big death. That's a little bit challenging for Fomoria. Um, if you do uh, like a Mound Fiend, I think can get you up into bigger death, but he doesn't show up until level 7. Because I believe Mound Fiends are level 4, maybe? They might be level 3 though. But anyhow, uh, a very potent unit, and I don't want to dive into too much into the weeds too far and trying to figure out like how far they boost and stuff like that, but uh, exceptionally powerful battlefield mage. They can also, I completely forgot to show you, where is it? And is it under, no, not there. Sorry, especially with the new, why would I look under? Curse of Balor? What's that one? Oh, blindness. Nightmare masks makes your soldiers spooky, and then somewhere here there should be Wailing Winds. I'm just not sure if it is under. I can't remember what school it is under. Cloud of Winds of Death is another key thing that they're able to cast. Yeah, that makes everybody suck. Um, the problem is this will affect your guys too. However, even your Fomorians don't have the worst magic resistance. So if you're going up against a low magic resistance enemy, then Winds of Death, and then Wailing Winds as well is a spell that they're able to cast. So a fantastic unit. And I think that's probably where I'm going to leave it here as I accidentally exit out. We've taken a look at their troop lineup. We've looked at some of their things. And A couple of observations that I want to kind of leave off with before uh, we move on to god design in the next episode is looking at their mage paths. We've got a little bit of access to like water and nature and earth. We only have one point in. Most of the others were quite a bit higher. Air in particular, we can do basically do whatever air we want. We can summon queens of elemental air with our Fomorian kings. Um, Glamour, again, we can get into very big glamour. Um, Need to check and make sure, but I'm pretty sure we can dive into fairly deep glamour. Death, we can do big death, not quite the biggest, but we can get very deep into death. Um, and that's really important to keep in mind once we start getting to pretender design. Our troop lineup is durable but struggles with killing, and our mages are very good at killing. So that gives us kind of the foundation around which we probably want to build our strategy. And what that strategy, in my mind at least, leans towards is a bless to help our druids and our kings. It would be nice if we could help the sorceresses too, but unfortunately they are not sacred, which is a little bit sad. So, um, yeah, that's something to consider. And that will be the topic for episode 2 or part 2, where we dive into what to do once you hit this screen. So, until then, cheers.